The painting had hung in the same position for years. It showed Diana in the way that formal royal portraits show their subjects, composed, appropriate, the careful rendering of a public figure rather than the private person. But it was her face, her eyes, the specific quality of her presence that photographers and painters had struggled to capture and occasionally managed. And it had been on the wall at Kensington Palace long enough to become part of the landscape of the place, not just an image but an anchor, a daily reminder of who had lived there and what she had meant. The order to remove it did not come from no one. It came from the king. Charles had his reasons. He would have had reasons. He was a man who believed in institutional continuity, in the forward motion of the monarchy, in the idea that what had been difficult in the past should eventually give way to the arrangement that now existed. He had married Camilla. He was the king. The institutions needed to reflect the present, but William was in the palace when the instruction came through. And William's reaction left the room silent. This is that story, not just the portrait, but everything the portrait represents, and why a son's response to his father's decision carries a weight that goes far beyond the question of what to understand why the portrait mattered enough to produce the reaction it produced. You have to understand something about how grief lives in physical spaces. William had been 12 years old when his mother died. He was in Scotland. He was told by his father in private before the news reached the world, and then he was required, as a royal child, to continue performing the functions of royal childhood, to appear, to walk, to stand with a composure that no 12-year-old should have been asked to maintain in front of cameras while the whole world watched. The palace spaces where Diana had lived were not primarily places of grief for William and Harry after her death. They were places of connection, the rooms she had moved through, the chairs she had sat in, the photographs and portraits, and small personal objects that her presence had left behind in the institutional record of the places where she had been most fully herself. Objects that remain in physical space when a person has left are not simply objects. For children who lose a parent young, they become something closer to proof, tangible evidence that the person was real, that the love was real, that the memory is not simply constructed from photographs and other people's stories. You can stand in front of the portrait and remember that she stood in that room too. You can feel the continuity across the gap. When Charles ordered the portrait's removal, he was making a decision about institutional presentation. What he was also doing, whether he understood it or not, was intervening in the geography of his son's grief. William understood this immediately. His reaction reflected that understanding. There is a story that leads to this moment, and it runs through years of complicated family territory that William has occasionally allowed the public to see and has more often protected behind the careful boundaries that his position and his character both require. William has spoken publicly about the inadequacy of the support he and Harry received after Diana's death, the sense that the institution moved forward before either of them had been given the space or the resources to process what had happened. Diana herself, before her death, had spoken about the particular loneliness of being inside the royal family, the way that emotional difficulty was treated as something to be managed and contained rather than acknowledged and addressed. William had not been asked whether he was ready to move on. The institution had moved on and expected him to move with it. He had been 12 and then 14 and then 18, and then he was at university and then in the military and then engaged. And at each stage the expectation was that the forward motion continued and that grief was something private that happened separately from the public role. He had complied with this, largely. He is a man who understands duty and has accepted its demands. But compliance with expectation is not the same as the absence of feeling, and the feeling had accumulated across the years in ways that occasionally became visible. The portrait represented one of those visibility moments. When his father ordered its removal, William's response was not simply about a painting. It was about everything the request to move the painting represented, about what was being asked to disappear, and who was being asked to be fine with the disappearance. The specific words that William used in the moment when the instruction reached him have not been made fully public, which is characteristic of how these moments tend to be handled in the institution. What has emerged through the various accounts, through credible reporting, through the books that have documented the family dynamics of this period, is a description of the quality of his response. He did not comply. More than that, he made clear, in terms that were sufficiently direct to produce the silence described by those who were present, that this was not a matter he was prepared to treat as resolved by instruction. there is something significant about a future king refusing a current king. The institutional structure of the monarchy is one in which hierarchy is not abstract. It is the actual organizing principle of how decisions are made and who is authorized to make them. When William declined to accept this particular decision without resistance, he was asserting something about where his own authority to protect his mother's memory began, regardless of what the institutional hierarchy might prefer. The room went silent because the people in it understood what they were witnessing, not a family argument in the ordinary domestic sense, something more precise, a son establishing, clearly and without apology, that there were things he would not be moved on. His mother was one of them. The portrait dispute lives within a longer story about how Diana's memory has been managed, by the institution, by Charles, by William and Harry, and by the public that has never quite stopped wanting to understand what she was and what her life meant. Charles has had a complicated relationship with Diana's legacy since before she died. While she was alive, the relationship was adversarial enough that both parties eventually gave major interviews to document their respective experiences of the marriage and its failure. After her death, the adversarial relationship shifted into something more complex, the management of an icon whose popularity had far exceeded any institutional expectation. The British public's devotion to Diana did not follow the arc that palace advisors might have hoped for. It did not diminish with time in the way that emotional intensity around public figures sometimes does. Instead, it deepened into something more complicated, into a sustained affection that was also a sustained critique, an ongoing meditation on what the monarchy had done to a woman who had tried to bring something human into its centre. Charles's coronation as king required him to navigate this complicated legacy. He could not ignore Diana. She was the mother of the future king, and her presence in public memory was too large to be simply set aside. But he also could not be expected to place her legacy at the centre of a reign that he had built around a different version of the institution. What the portrait question represents is the ongoing friction between these two imperatives, the king who needs to move forward and the son who cannot move forward in the specific way his father would prefer. It is impossible to discuss William's position on his mother's legacy without accounting for what Harry's departure from royal life has changed. For years, William and Harry shared the labour of protecting and representing Diana's memory. They appeared together at public commemorations. They co-founded the charitable organisations that continued her work. They collaborated on the memorial projects and the public statements that marked significant anniversaries. The sharing of the burden made the burden manageable. Harry's exit from the formal structures of royal life did not end his relationship with his mother's legacy. If anything, his public statements and the contents of his memoir suggest that the relationship has intensified and become more explicitly connected to his critique of the institution. But it did end the collaboration. William now carries this particular responsibility alone within the family. This changes the dynamic of moments like the portrait dispute, when William resists his father's decisions about how Diana's memory is housed and displayed. He is not one of two sons speaking. He is the Prince of Wales, the future king, speaking for himself and for his family's branch of the legacy, without the counterbalance of a brother who could share both the position and the friction it creates. The isolation of that position gives his resistance a different weight. It costs more. And it reflects a commitment to his mother's presence that has survived not only the loss itself but the institutional pressure to minimize that loss and the personal loss of the partner who had shared the carrying of it. Any honest account of the portrait dispute has to acknowledge the role that Camilla's presence as queen consort plays in the dynamics it represents. Diana's relationship with Camilla was not simply the relationship between a wife and her husband's former lover. It was the relationship between a woman who was being pushed out of a marriage and the woman who represented why the marriage had failed. Diana spoke about it with a directness that the institution found uncomfortable and that the public found clarifying. She understood exactly what Camilla represented, and she had made her position on that representation clear. William grew up watching his mother navigate this situation. He watched her on the public stage, and he was aware, in the way that children of difficult marriages are always aware, even when they are not told directly, of what was happening in private. His understanding of Camilla is therefore not simply the understanding of a stepchild adjusting to a new family member. It is the understanding of a son who watched what the existence of that relationship cost his mother. This does not mean William has been publicly hostile to Camilla. He has not. He understands institutional necessity and he has conducted himself accordingly. But it does mean that decisions which invoke the question of how Diana's memory is preserved in spaces that Camilla now also inhabits carry a particular complexity for him. The portrait was not simply a portrait of Diana. In the context of where it hung and who now also inhabits those spaces, it was a statement about whose presence mattered in the institution. When Charles ordered its removal, he was making a statement intentionally or not about the answer to that question. William's response was a statement about who got to make that determination. The silence that followed William's reaction was not simply the quiet that follows an uncomfortable moment. It was the silence of a room that had just watched a future king establish a boundary. William is not a man who makes dramatic gestures. He is, by character and by the training that his position has required, someone who understands the value of measured response, of not saying the fullest version of what he thinks in every moment it could be said. This restraint has occasionally been read as emotional distance, but people who know him describe it differently, as the discipline of someone who understands that what a future king says carries institutional weight that requires care. When that discipline produces the specific quality of response it produced in this moment, when the measured man speaks with unmistakable directness, the people in the room understand that something important has been communicated. What was communicated was this: there are limits to how far the institutional imperative of forward motion can travel into the personal territory of his grief. His mother's image in the spaces where she lived is within those limits, and he will not pretend otherwise to make the current arrangement more comfortable. This is, in the context of a monarchy built on precedent and institutional continuity, a significant statement. It is also, in the context of a son who lost his mother at 12 and has been managing that loss within the fishbowl of public life ever since, a completely human one. William is aware that he will eventually be king. This awareness shapes everything about how he manages the present, including moments like this one. He has spoken, in interviews and through the charitable and public work he has invested most heavily in, about wanting to be a different kind of king, about the monarchy having to evolve to remain relevant, about the importance of emotional honesty in public life, a quality he has identified as his mother's specific contribution to how the monarchy was understood. When he resists the erasure of Diana's portrait from the spaces where she lived, he is not simply acting as a grieving son. He is also making a statement about the kind of institution he intends to inhabit when his time comes, about what values he believes the monarchy should carry forward, about whose presence in its history deserves to be marked and remembered. Diana had, by the end of her life, understood the power of the institution well enough to use it against itself, to speak to millions of people through the very media structure that the palace had tried to control. William has inherited that understanding. He knows that the decisions made now about whose portraits hang where, whose memory is centered or marginalized, are decisions about what the institution believes about itself. His resistance to his father's instruction is therefore not simply personal. It is political in the structural sense, a future leader making clear that his tenure will not be built on the erasure of. There is something worth saying about portraits specifically, and why they matter in ways that extend beyond their obvious function as images. Portraits in royal spaces are not decoration. They are formal statements about whose presence the institution acknowledges as part of its story. The people on the walls of palaces are the people whom the institution has decided belong in its narrative. Their inclusion is a choice, and so is their exclusion. When Charles ordered Diana's portrait removed, he was, whether he intended this consciously or not, making a statement about her place in the institutional narrative going forward. He was the king. The institution now organized itself around him and around the marriage he had built with Camilla. Diana was the past. The portrait was a complication. William understood this. What he also understood was that his mother's place in the institutional narrative is not Charles's to determine alone. It is also the future king's to determine, and the future king has a different view of what that narrative should include. The silence that followed his response was the recognition of this by everyone present, the recognition that they had just witnessed the beginning of a disagreement that would not be resolved by a single instruction, no matter who issued it. The portrait, in whatever eventual disposition it found, is a marker in a story that is still being written. Diana has been dead for more than 25 years. The intensity with which she is still discussed, still mourned, still defended, is a reflection of something that her death did not resolve and that time has not significantly diminished. Represented for millions of people who never met her, a particular vision of what it meant to be human inside an institution that often demanded the suppression of humanity. Her loss created a wound in the public imagination that has not healed because the conditions that created the wound have not fundamentally changed. William carries this. He carries it as her son. He carries it as the future king of an institution that she both loved and struggled with. He carries it as a man who was 12 years old when she died and has been navigating the aftermath ever since, in public, in private, and in the moments like this one where the two territories collide. His reaction to the portrait's removal was one of those moments. It told the room and, through the accounts that have emerged, tells us something important about where he stands, about what he will fight for when fighting is required, about whose memory he will protect when protection costs something. He will protect his mother's, regardless of who issues the instruction to do otherwise. The room that went silent did not stay silent. Rooms never do. The conversation moved on. The institution continued. The day progressed in the way that days in palaces progress, with the overlay of duty and the machinery of formality covering whatever has been said in the moments that matter. But what was said, and those who were present knew what they had witnessed. A son defending his mother's place in the story against a father who had decided that story should be managed differently. Whether that particular portrait was ultimately moved or stayed, whether this particular dispute was resolved or simply deferred, is in some ways beside the point. What William had established in the silence that followed his response was something that would not be undone by the outcome of any single decision. He would be the steward of his mother's legacy. He would decide how it was honored and how it was protected. He would not be moved on the question of whether she deserved to occupy space in the institution she had served, even when the institution's current leadership preferred a different arrangement. This is what the silence carried. This is why it lasted as long as it did. A portrait is a small thing, in the physical sense, paint on canvas, a frame on a wall, an arrangement that can be altered by the direction of any person with sufficient institutional authority. What William said, by refusing to accept the direction without response, was that some things are not altered by institutional authority alone. His mother's place in the story is one of them.